project started, well, we started talking with Jamie about doing some kind of work and responding to this idea of seeking Silicon Valley, and I, kind of the studio that I'm part of, is very San Francisco based. It's hard. I don't really drive a car all that much, so I don't make it down here all that well. And so we started thinking about kind of what the view of what Silicon Valley looks like from San Francisco, because there's some relationships are very strong and some are kind of tenuous. And we started thinking about, we design a lot of maps, and it seemed pretty clear that we were going to want to make some kind of map of some kind. And we started thinking about data flows, transportation flows. Should we model the real estate? Should we model the population density? There's a whole lot of just to sort of take a sort of look at the Long Peninsula and kind of see what the two kind of ends of it are and what kind of connects them. We started thinking about all the different kind of ways that people get back and forth, and also the kind of data that might be available about that region. And the more we thought about it, the less we wanted to do something that we'd sort of seen before, because people have seen maps of cars moving around, and we've seen maps of real estate, and so we wanted to kind of come up with a new view and a kind of a view that was very much about the theme of the exhibition. So we started thinking about the buses that we see a lot from our studio in the Mission. There's in the last probably, I don't know how long it's been now, but it's definitely in the last 5 years, it's just grown like crazy. And you used to see 1 or 2 buses every once in a while, and now by the time I walk from the train to my office, I see at least 3 or 4 just in those 10 minutes. So it's they're these kind of gigantic, and you can see there's a picture of one of them there, and right there, they're these kind of giant 2-story, 60-person buses that are kind of sailing through residential neighborhoods. And it sort of occurred to us that it'd be nice to be able to tell where they're going, just to be able to see, because they're mostly kind of anonymously marked and that kind of stuff. And the more that we did some research on this, and the more we kind of asked around, and we started talking to the city of San Francisco about it. We started talking to Facebook and Google and Apple just to see if they had maps. Started seeing what they had, and everybody was really cagey about it. No one really wanted to tell us where they were, and there's a bunch of reasons, and we could get into that. But we kind of realized that there was this thing hiding in plain sight that was kind of representative of this real fundamental shift in how people in San Francisco were viewing their relationship to the South Bay and to Silicon Valley, and then that there just wasn't any information that was freely available about it. So with the money that we got from the commission, we decided that we were going to do an investigation of our own. And we used a project that we've initiated at the studio called Field Papers, which is a kind of mapping, atlasing, paper-based software for gathering geographic data. And we started by myself, my partner Mike, and our art director George sitting in a cafe really early in the morning at 18th and Dolores in the Mission District, and we were just shocked at how many buses there were. I mean, it was something like, I think we saw personally something like 400 people at this one stop. I mean, just like gigantic amounts of buses. So we just sat there and kind of copied it down and realized that there was something here. And so with the money that the commission afforded, we just basically hired a fleet of bike messengers and other people from Kickstarter and a couple other services to kind of fan out and check out this. And we had one woman from Sunnyvale who came in to stand at the corner of 8th and Market, downtown San Francisco, for 7 hours, and she told us she was just never going to do that again. It was just too hectic over there. But it was a pretty interesting sort of experience to kind of gather all this material. I should say that before that happened, we looked on Foursquare. George looked on Foursquare, and just this idea that Google was being really cagey about where the stops were was just this kind of hilarious, almost absurd situation, because there's Google spray painted on the sidewalk at the stop at 18th and Dolores, and you can go on Foursquare, and Google employees are checking in at these stops pretty constantly, right? So this idea that it was kind of out there, but that the companies were going to disavow it just seemed like a fun thing to do. The sketchy part about the project for us is that before we started it, we had never worked for Google or Facebook before. And as we started to work on the project, we got 2 commercial commissions from Facebook and Google. And I think Jamie was a little upset with me that I was being really cagey about the project before we started, because I wasn't sure up until the time that the project launched whether we would get sued or not. So I was trying to be a little cagey about, I didn't want to necessarily associate myself with it or give all that many interviews, but after it was launched, we got actually calls from our clients at Google and Facebook that were like, hey, we saw that thing that you made about the buses. It's super awesome. So it all worked out. But that's kind of the general sort of, that's the genesis of the project. And it's been, there's a bunch of stuff to talk about, but a lot of that's going to come out in questions. And so I'll just kind of leave it there.
Well, so I'm Egon Terplan, and I work at a group called SPUR, which is an urban civic group based in San Francisco, recently opened an office in San Jose earlier this year. And we spent a lot of time thinking about the future of the Bay Area. We've worked a lot on the future of San Francisco and involved in a bunch of issues: transportation, land use, housing, economic development. And I've been kind of involved with the related issues around this, looking at both the transit systems, but also at the evolution of work. And earlier this year, we did a report on the urban future of work, and that was trying to understand work as it's changing and evolving, but trying to make an argument that, and a year and a half ago, it feels a little bit different now, in the kind of depths of the recession, there was something happening very profound in the Bay Area, which was this increasing interest in density on the part of companies. Companies both shifting to urban places, but also companies in more suburban places decreasing the square footage per worker. So this recognition that having people bump into each other more so in environments is important for companies, it's important for economic growth. And so we wrote something about it, and the shuttle piece comes up because the shuttle piece is a way of bringing people from particular urban centers out to the workplaces. But I look at this question here, not so much from a San Francisco perspective, but from the destination side. The shuttle is reflective of a land use problem. It's reflective of a land use problem because there isn't transit that goes to these places where a lot of the jobs are now. Even though the densities are increasing, they're still not dense enough to support transit systems, and there's certainly not, a lot of the jobs are not located in the traditional downtowns that built up around the train stations. So if there had been tens of thousands of jobs growing up in downtown Mountain View, downtown Palo Alto, downtown San Jose, the shuttle phenomenon would not be happening, even if a lot of those people were coming from San Francisco. Now that's a hypothesis, but it's in part because if you look at people that come from other parts of the Bay Area to downtown San Francisco as a place, a lot of them are coming on BART. Some of them are coming on AC, but a very small share are driving. People take public transit systems if they're convenient. People take private transit if they're convenient, and also because there's not an alternative. There are shuttles, and we can talk a little bit about that some of these companies run from Caltrain stations to the campuses, but that is a very small share of what people do. Fundamentally in transit, people don't like transferring. They like a one-seat ride, door to door, relatively speaking, door to door from your home or somewhere near your home to the front door of your office. In transit, people talk about something called the last mile problem. Silicon Valley, it's more like a 1 to 3 mile problem, that a lot of these jobs are 1 to 3 miles from the Caltrain corridor. So just as a starting point, I kind of like to put that out there, that this is not, what you're seeing here is a system, but it's also a system that's reflective of the other end. And a question back to you all might be thinking about what can happen at the other end that would change this, that this would become something that would start to look different. But maybe let's close it. I'm going to kind of push back to you guys on a question. What is this map? What do you want this map to show? When people look at this map, you're talking about kind of the broader story, but when they see the map for the first time, what's the message that you want them to walk away with, or what do you want them to understand after seeing this map?
The first thing I wanted to make sure was that we didn't get sued. So that was, and I'll just keep using that joke throughout the presentation. When I look at it, we're in the Mission District, which is a sort of traditionally kind of immigrant neighborhood. It was an Irish neighborhood for a long time. It was a German neighborhood for a long time. It was a Mexican neighborhood for a long time, and now it's becoming a kind of yuppie neighborhood. And a lot of the kind of rhetoric around the buses and about Facebook and the changing Bay Area and tech and all this kind of stuff is sort of localized there because it's the place that's changed the most rapidly. And so my impression, just from having seen the buses, was that they left from the Mission and went down to Silicon Valley. That was just kind of what was in my mind. This shard up there was a total surprise to me, that anybody was taking a bus from the marina down to Facebook. It just, I guess Google needs dudes with baseball hats on backwards and flip-flops, just as much as it needs guys with little mustaches. So that was what I wanted to kind of the thing that it showed me was that it's a citywide phenomenon. You know, that it's something that's like I mean, it's just all over town. The west side of town not so much, but people have more cars out there anyhow. So it's kind of, you know, but it's sort of a. So I wanted to kind of, so that was super key that I wanted people to take away from the project, and I should say we, because Zach and I worked on it together. But also I think that that it's a giant network, that it's not a couple buses. It's really, I mean, we've been talking about it, we spent a bunch of time talking about it yesterday, maybe we should do this again next year. And what I really want to think about is the future of this kind of thing, because if this is what's grown up in 5 years, what's it going to look like in 10 or 15 years? I mean, it's not like, you know, the internet is going away. So it's pretty likely that there's going to be places down there, and and it's pretty likely that people are still going to work in San Francisco. So we were trying to kind of more have it as a provocation of just getting people to kind of look at it and think like, whoa, this is this thing that I've heard of and I've seen these buses, but like, shit, it's like, it's everywhere.
It's interesting, though, because you're referring to it as a network. And in some ways, I think what this does is an incredible service you're getting at. It puts it on a map and says, this is a phenomenon. This is something happening. It's big. It's all over San Francisco. It's many companies. But I think the interesting part about it for me is it makes it appear like a network from a transit standpoint. Transit riders, when you go to New York City, you go to any city, you pick up a map, it shows where all the stops are. It's a network. You can get on at one, get off at another, and travel that entire geography. This is not that, right? These are a series of, in a sense, kind of private river flows where you can only get on if you're of that company. And so anyway, you kind of reflect a little bit on the private nature of this. You're using a map, which is something we see in transit, which is public, but these are not public.
Right, even to the point of like, of these kinds of things, which is, you know, that there's a tunnel underneath that goes, right? Yeah.
I mean, I think to a large extent, we're looking at some of the most, like, the largest networks, right? We're definitely, there's a lot of these that are a bunch of smaller companies that we aren't looking at. You know, this is 6, this isn't even, you know, basically Google, Facebook, and Apple are like the big fish in the pond. And so it is sort of an interesting idea because, so Google specifically does sort of get to this point of, it's not a network because you're not getting off here, except that there actually is a Google SF branch. But, you know, I mean, you look at this and, you know, you talk about it being a river, right? Well, okay, so that's, you know, these are all the tributaries and that's where it's going. And it is this very sort of a bunch of overlapping rivers that actually don't touch each other at all, which is interesting. And so actually, so when we were looking at this, sort of, you know, we'd first come down to see the space, and we had no idea what we were talking about, like what we were going to be discussing, or like making or thinking about. One of the things that we started thinking about was when we were going to Caltrain, there's a bus map of all of the buses that feed into Caltrain, and there's half a dozen different networks. And that idea of, you know, there's all of these different networks that are overlaid on each other. And the Bay Area in general has
27.
Thank you.
27 different transit operators, public
right.
transit.
And I think, to me, there's a really interesting, the idea of this as a sort of proto-transit network is really interesting to me, where, you know, a lot of, you know, early train networks were built up by developers to go to a specific suburb, and then at some point became public. And this is sort of, it's not there, right? Like, you've got all of these buses, they're private, they're not connected, they don't actually like, this is us being cute. This is not a real thing. You know, it gets the emphasis of like, these are all the same plot, you know, they're wide lines, you have to do something to show where they're all stopping, but it's not like you can get on that bus and get on the other bus. But at the same time, that's sort of an exaggeration of a similar thing that goes on where, you know, in San Francisco specifically, you've got Golden Gate Transit, you've got Muni, you've got BART, you've got a bunch of these things, and they're getting, I think, getting better at it, and they're definitely at a spot where you can transfer, but it's still not a network. It's a series of networks. And the fact that this is a series of networks with walls around them, which means you can't go between them, I think is a really interesting part of this, is that you've got this, you know, this giant river, I think to a certain extent exists because of those breakups of networks in the public sphere,
Yeah.
where the fact that I can't get on a Muni bus and have it be synced up with the train so that I get off at exactly the right time and get on my next train, and then I get on the right bus at the end. Like to a certain extent, that fact of these multiple transfers and these multiple systems is why this exists.
Did you, in the course of this, interview people that were taking it, and sort of on twofold? One, did any of them say, I wish I could go and take it to visit my friend at EA one day and at Google, or ride it home with them if I happen to meet them at lunch? Was there desire for that kind of connection or transferring between systems ever?
Don't know. We didn't do any interviews. One thing that's interesting, so not on this map, but equal in scale, is Genentech's system, which actually does allow other people to use it. It's a sort of an interesting case because they have a lot of people coming to visit them. They have a lot of, sort of non-employees using their network, and so they've gone to the point of you can go on their website and look at the map, and it's huge, and you can get on them, and it's not. It's approaching that of if you want to go visit your friend at Genentech, you actually can. You can get on their buses and go there.
And the Genentech one's an interesting story because it was part of a very much a rational decision on their part because of the high cost of parking. They're stuck out at the end of the peninsula. They have to build structured parking. They grew really fast. They're running out of space, and adding additional parking is very expensive, $100,000 a space. And so investing in a transit system that's open to others makes it easier. But a little bit, and I don't know if we want to talk about the motivations of the companies. You were, in a sense, coming from the San Francisco standpoint, but it's they have different motivations for doing it, but a lot of it comes from the notion of really attracting the best people, right? It's really an amenity. It's part of attracting people, keeping them there, but it also has a land use component, meaning you can't actually, if the companies, some of them want to redevelop where they are. They want to build additional buildings. And you can't build buildings on surface parking lots unless you reduce the demand for people to fill up those surface parking lots. And this is sort of an interesting issue in Silicon Valley, that you get declining square feet per worker, right? You build an office building. In the old days, it might have 4 people per 1,000 square feet. Now it's getting down to 8 or 9 people per 1,000 square feet. So more people going into the same physical building with the same amount of parking around. Now we see those big seas of parking. In order to build buildings on top of those parking lots and make these campus areas something that's not, that's a little bit more humane, easier to walk around, more lovely, more urban, more other things that are starting to maybe happen, you need to get the number of people driving alone down. You need to change that mode share, as a transit word. So in a sense, the shuttle becomes a way to allow you to redevelop the campus as part of it.
Are there in the valley, are there the same kind of growth restrictions on these campuses?
It depends city by city, and we can get into this in the discussion. The Bay Area has got 101 cities. The 101 cities hold the cards about what gets built and what doesn't get built in their communities. Talk about fragmentation. That's one of our big kind of regional challenges. And a lot of those communities don't want to grow much. They tend to be more supportive of job growth than residential growth, because job growth brings greater tax revenue than residential development. Mountain View, for example, this past year approved a new general plan that allows a tripling of the number of jobs and density in the North Bayshore area. But, it just sort of came out yesterday, they're going to put the Google campus plans on hold for a little bit because all those people coming down 101, there's just a couple of ways to get into that area. And so thinking about, well, if we're going to have that many more people working out here with these new buildings, there's a transportation system that they have to work. And the shuttles are only carrying maybe a third of the people going to Google, right? There's still 2/3 of the people coming other ways. Some of them on bike, but most of them are driving or carpooling.
In some ways, that's I think a big, okay, what we wanted to do is to kind of build a thing that you could kind of pull on and talk about the Bay Area in a way that was constructive, or just in a way that was not just abstract, or because planning can be a little bit abstract. So, but I mean, the idea that there's 101 cities in the Bay Area, it just seems like I'm from New York, and that just seems crazy. Just that sort of. But one of the other speakers that was here, I think, made the really interesting point about the whole capital of Silicon Valley. Like there isn't one. That's the point. Get over it. You know, it's like But what we wind up with in this kind of anarchic system is no centralized transportation ability, right? I mean, the mayor can't just say there's going to be a subway that goes from downtown San Francisco to Sunnyvale, and it happened. I mean, there's always more to it than that. But there is no group, and so this is sort of what happens when it's sort of a natural outgrowth of that kind of anarchic.
But also the land use issue, if you got 101 in these kind of eastern areas. I mean, for decades, the Bay was the dumping ground for the Bay Area until we decided to not let it get filled in and paved over. And so you've got all this land east and north of 101 that these communities are happy having jobs there, not housing, and so that they can protect their existing neighborhoods without the transformation. And that's sort of a push and pull. And that's why I started by saying this is a land use issue. If you had 30-story office towers in downtown Mountain View and a lot of these places, you would have electrified Caltrain. You could run it much more as an overall subway system. But it's that's the challenge of making these things change once it's slow, right? It's slow to change the governance. And these companies here, and I've sat and seen them in some of these places, they can switch within a matter of minutes where a bus goes.
Right.
Right?
And that was one of the reasons they told us of why they didn't want to give us the maps or the routes because they're changing them all the time, right? So that's and they do change them, right?
And in addition to the idea of changing bus routes, like the reason that these companies have all these people living in San Francisco and most of them don't have offices there. I mean, Google does because they're enormous, but most of them don't. Is again land use, right? Like. People want to live in San Francisco. It's really, really expensive to have your office there. So, and especially when you're talking about internet companies, you're talking about startups, which at this point, these people are not necessarily, but the reason they started in Silicon Valley and not in San Francisco is because of land, because it's cheaper, there's more space. You can do that in a way that you could not do in the city where there is somewhat better transit. Then between these, like the reason there's this sort of long gap between the people and where they're working, in addition to like you can't house them there, is you can't build the office where they are.
I think that in some of that, are pieces that could change. I mean, yes, you could. You can put tech workers in vertical towers. San Francisco is a cumbersome place to build buildings, and a lot of it is this desire for kind of bigger floor plates and other things, and this historical relationship. A lot of this stuff comes out of Stanford. I know we mentioned San Jose State, where all the engineers come from, but a lot of the money flows from Palo Alto.
Well, and in addition to just the space, there's a certain amount of just like, a lot of these companies are moving and expanding extremely quickly, and San Francisco is, even if you can find the place, have the money, want to build the giant office tower, that's slow.
It takes time. Let's take some questions. I think there was.
Sure.
I know the purpose of this wasn't for policy development, but more for art and technology and so forth. But have you thought about sharing your findings with the MTC, with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission?
Yeah, they're one of our clients, and we've talked with them about that. They're currently putting forward I forget the name of it, but they have a plan that they're getting ready to start to talk about in public with people. And this is part of it. It's a good suggestion. I hadn't thought it. I thought they would have just had it already.
All the transit agencies that run up and down. I take BART, Caltrain, and Muni all the time. All those agencies plus Valley Transit and everybody else would love to have all these riders on there. I would think they're all short of revenue, although Caltrain's getting amazingly full. But it's really too bad that this has to exist, because you've got all these sort of quasi-starving transit agencies that could carry all these people if things would just work better.
Right.
So, and maybe
I think
there's now enough money, maybe you could get Google to say, look, we'll give you half the money we would have otherwise used for this, and we'll save half, and Caltrain will get a bunch more riders, but it's got to work beautifully,
I mean, this is one of the things I wanted to talk with you about, and maybe there's people here who know more about this, is, can we think about what this is going to look like in 10 years, right? Like, I mean, if this didn't exist, I don't want to say definitively it didn't exist, but it's certainly a lot more than it was 5 years ago. It's just increased dramatically, even since the last official plan that the city put out. It's something like 5 times the number of buses. So, if we can kind of think about, I mean, that was in some ways the point of this, was to kind of draw a line in the sand and say this is what it's like now. What is actually the relationship between this and the private or the public networks? And I mean, the number that we came up with, we conservatively estimate that this transportation network, I'm just going to keep calling it that, even though it's not, or this transportation system carries about a third as many people as Caltrain does on a given day. So it's significant.
Great example of a private network that's open to the public that interfaces really well with other networks is Stanford's Marguerite system. If this could run more like that, these systems could run more like that, it would really tremendously benefit the Bay Area, I think.
Right.
I think what you're getting into, though, is the motivation of why the companies do it, and some of it is if it's really treated as an amenity for the employees. This stuff, I spent a lot of time at MTC, and these discussions have certainly come up there. MTC took a run at looking at the kind of budget crisis that was facing transit over the last couple of years, and there was really a great opportunity to do some mergers, to make some big changes. Didn't happen. We can get into the kind of politics, which is not what this panel's about, why that didn't happen. But I think this is out there, and a thing we haven't talked about is this is an innovation in a sense in moving people around, and these companies are highly innovative. They're doing a really good job of it and able to kind of get the information about their employees and their customers, basically. They're riders on the systems that transit operators could learn from. I think this is not, Google's not going to give some money to a public agency to run this thing for them. I don't think it makes sense for them. But over time, this is why I think we have to think much more broadly about the land use piece. And I have some thoughts on that, but we don't need to. Let's get some other questions.
I work for a company which just opened a similar bus line like this a month ago, and we witnessed very low ridership, almost 1 or 2% of the population living in the city. I don't know, besides the route that you have there, do you have any estimate of how many people are taking these rides? And then with this sort of a low ridership that we saw right now, I don't know if this would be justified physically, from a public, transportation perspective. I mean, Google's or Facebook with deep pockets, they probably can support it in the long term. Sure. But the question is, how do we promote the ridership, and then to a point that the public transportation system can, chime in. So
correct me if I'm wrong, Zach, but the estimate that we came up with, and this is, we didn't go to every one and count. We didn't go to every stop and count every one. We've made some estimates, but broadly, we think there's about 8,000 people a day on the system.
8,000 a day.
But you're raising a great point, which is we don't know how much those companies are paying per rider. Right? When the ferry system opens up and comes to, I think comes down by Genentech, it's in Mateer and Ross that the subsidy is $90 each way per rider, and it's this sort of political scandal, and this happens all the time. There's no political scandal here because yes, there's local San Francisco politics about blocking Muni things, but there's nothing on the cost because it's not public investment in it, which is great because it's cars being taken off the road at the dime of the private companies, so there's a regional benefit to it, but we don't know how much they're paying. I think the other thing you're getting at, though, has to do with why people don't use their personal automobile. And one of the things a writer on transit, Jarrett Walker, writes about a lot is frequency is freedom, as just sort of a simple notion. If a train, a bus runs frequently enough, you're willing to not use your car. And so Google, the biggest one here, gets 90% of the people who work for Google and live in San Francisco take the shuttle to work. It's an almost unheard of number in transit. And the reason is because Google is running those very frequently.
Yeah, at least like peak travel times, at least 20 per stop. Like from 7 in the morning until about 9:30, there's 20 buses.
Right, and so and you're at Google, you can take it back to different neighborhoods in San Francisco. You can finish your task and go out and grab it, as opposed to another company that might have 2 or 3 over the course of the commute ride home. And if you miss something, you have to run late, then you're stuck there. So I think that's a piece of the challenge. If you're not big enough to scale it, then you can't do it frequently enough.
Is this on? Oh, thanks. I have a nature of work question. This map also seems to reflect the preference of these companies for, as you mentioned, large floor plate, horizontal offices, which, as I understand, were thought to facilitate communication and creativity among employees. And when you say that they're looking for increased density, is that philosophy changing? It's a little ironic that companies that help people communicate remotely feel that they need to be able to walk to each other's offices, which may be true, but what are you seeing there? And then second question is, it seems traditionally the smart growth advocacy community has been much more focused on increasing the density of housing rather than employment, and why has that been?
Those are great questions. So maybe let me take the second one first. The smart growth community has been pushing the, transit-oriented development is a phrase, TOD, for many people means residential. And I think it for a couple reasons. One, because they didn't think about the question of work. They didn't understand as much the relationship between work and transit. It's easier for a community to change its zoning to allow housing, and the housing might come in a place like the Bay Area where traditionally we haven't built enough housing, and that's one of our economic challenges. That's why there's not as much job growth here. We don't build enough housing, that if you actually just change the zoning, allow the housing, it'll happen. Not true with jobs, right? Most communities want the jobs because of the tax revenues. And so there's been this assumption in the Bay Area that the problem is we got to force the Palo Altos and the Menlo Parks and the Mountain Views to add the housing. And so the smart growth community has been there and has been pushing that. Without thinking as much, and this is something we've been pushing for a number of years, that if you want to get people out of their cars, actually having transit at the end of the line at that station is actually a little bit more important than housing, because people are going to walk a shorter distance from the end of their trip than they are from the beginning. So you'll walk longer from your house or apartment to a bus stop than they will at the end. So I think it's changing and it's evolving, but it's been a slow slog. But part of it has to do with the tools are easier on the zoning side, that if you change the zoning to allow more residential, the market is typically stronger, particularly in this part of the Bay Area, right? It's been those communities that have not been as supportive of housing and more supportive of jobs. On the workplace question, I think if I understand what you're getting at is why are companies that are pushing mobility and the ability to communicate from anywhere in the world want their employees face to face? I think it's just an understanding of the importance of that innovation happens from that spontaneous interaction. It's also that companies look at their space and say, wait, those people are only at their desk 25, 30% of the time. Most of the time, people are not fundamentally sitting at their desks, so they're starting to reduce the square footage from a real estate perspective of saving costs, but they're also restructuring spaces, so it's not just a cube farm, but you might have a little cafe-looking area, and that the break room has the table where people can talk and interact. So it's changing work to be having different kinds of spaces for different kinds of tasks. And frankly, the shuttle is actually a place of work, which I think is sort of an interesting phenomena.
People are really quiet on them, but there's definitely Wi-Fi on them.
Right. They're not, you're not supposed to sit around a table and talk. I don't think they have any that have like a room where that takes place.
I mean,
Some industries seem to think that their employees can easily go up and down the elevator, up and down the stairs to hang out with each other versus horizontal. It seems to vary somewhat by industry. I'm just curious if you see a pattern.
Just anecdotally, the whole, we went down to Facebook to do some work with them, and there's like a whole cadre of guys who put the bicycles back in their racks. It's just this constant, just anecdotally, that it's sort of, I've never seen that before. That it seemed like, it's almost like going to UC Davis or something like that. Like everybody's just running around on bicycles. It seems exactly like a college campus. I don't know if that plays into it either.
Yeah, but you're sort of, I don't know, I don't think we know. Lots of companies can go vertical, and they will start doing so. I think some of it is an economic standpoint. Look, Adobe over here is in a vertical building. They're in a relative high rise. It doesn't mean that the people are flowing in the streets, and the streets are full of cafes, because they drive in, they park, they've got their cafeteria on one floor. So it's sort of the corporate campus just turned up on its side. But Pinger, which is also down the street, the biggest startup in downtown San Jose, they punched a nice little staircase in their building so people can walk back and forth upstairs. There are only 2 floors, there are only 60 people. But I think there's, yes, companies want big open spaces, but Google's in 15, 16, 17 buildings. So it's not possible for people to all be in one floor.
Maybe there's some others to think about. So there's Zynga, which is on like 6 floors, and they have that giant kind of open space in the middle of it. It has a very distinctive feel. Stamen is all on one floor. Where else have we been?
I don't know off the top of my head.
I mean, Google's downtown thing is on a bunch of different floors. So yeah, I don't know. Can we get some? There's some people over here too that have been asking.
Just a question. This is more putting a bug in your ear, but did you ever try, think, or hope to map any of this to demographics, age, profession, gender, immigrant, non-immigrant? Because I would love to see how this boils down, broken down further.
We thought about it and talked about it, but the exhibit opened when it opened, so we got as far as we could. Yeah, maybe. Well, no, I think there's legs here because, I mean, well, okay, so we sort of nodded to it by putting up some Craigslist ads that say Google, 2 steps to Google Bus, and that's, and Craigslist is easily mined, so that kind of thing would be really interesting.
I'm curious what it's like on the ground. I look at these nodes and they all look like they all intersect, and a lot of them are getting on the bus at the same time on Van Ness in the morning. And what is that like? Are they all on different lines, or are all these company people together? Are they in separate queues? And are these buses stopping at the existing Van Ness bus stops?
Yeah, I think that's one of the, we should both talk about that. I mean, one of the, it is a little bit of a, if you go to the stop that's at, was it 7th and Market? At the Civic Center, or, these Van Ness and Market, Mission 15th, these kind of, there's nothing visible, and then, kind of out of nowhere, a bunch of nerdy-looking people kind of all kind of, are standing there like this, and then they all get on the, it's like very, like, kind of, and a lot of times in neighborhoods where they wouldn't normally be, like Market and 8th is not, it's not a place for people. I mean, it's becoming more so with Twitter there and all that stuff, but, one of the big issues is, and this is why I think it's such an interesting thing to consider, is, they're using Muni spots a lot of the time, right? So, fireworks just explode when that happens because they're blocking the, these buses are blocking, they maybe make the buses delayed.
Well, I think that's the assumption. There's been, it's an interesting question. Are they blocking Muni buses? And my understanding from some of the analysis, it's infrequent, but it sometimes happens. And typically, at least I know with Google, this is their approach. If a Muni bus comes, Muni bus obviously has priority. It's, they own the Google bus or the shuttle should go around the corner. But I think a challenge though is with the proliferation of the number of them, they have different approaches to this, different policies internal. Who knows if some of the smaller ones will do the same thing.
Right, and they're not regulated in the same way, and so the city doesn't have control over it, and so should they allow it?
Should they be paying a square foot of curb space charge for the right to use that space?
Over the bus stop shelter seats, are they interacting with each other? Are they standing in different lines? How are they socially interacting with these?
Well, that's, I think, one of the interesting things is that it's, you can definitely tell that it's the Google people. You can tell that it's the Facebook people. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's like, well, because they're demographically, they're all like sort of the same kind of young, the same kind of glasses. It's like very like.
What they meant for each other.
Oh, with each other. I didn't observe people
There's
do
a
too
certain
much
amount
talking.
of different lines, but I mean, a lot of them are not necessarily at the same stop. In some of the sort of busier, Dolores and 18th, there are a bunch of them, but frequently, so especially with Google being just so big, much bigger than everyone else, frequently Google will have a stop and like maybe there's one other bus that comes through, but it's almost all the same company.
But are you asking relative to other companies or relative to the Muni riders?
She wants to know about like rumbles between the Googlers and the Apples.
Oh, yeah.
They just like beat each other up.
Looking at that visually, I thought they were all the exact same meeting spot. And maybe there's like a little Google thing sprayed here, there's another Yahoo here, but it's all the same spot.
We've definitely simplified things in a slightly not, a lot of these are, this is not necessarily one stop, this is probably a few for different companies. A lot of it is the same corner, or frequently they'll be, opposite corners of the same intersection, different companies will be picking up. You'll get this sort of like, they'll avoid each other a little bit, but there's a certain amount of crossover.
And just
especially
remember,
in
the
busy
buses
areas.
they're not waiting there like at a Greyhound station. They come in, they're loading in 45 seconds and moving on. So there's almost no Muni lines that are coming every 45 seconds. There's certainly none. So the idea is they're coming in between Muni, probably in between each other. I think the drivers of the different companies probably have some sense that the Yahoo bus comes at 8:20 and we get there at 8:24. And there's enough time within that to get buses in and out.
I'd like to switch this like a couple of degrees in a different direction. I mean, I don't know if you ever heard the expression, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
No.
You know, okay. So
It's interesting.
if you want to look at this from a transportation perspective, this looks like it's a transportation solution. But you could look at it from a completely different perspective, which has to do with the fact that San Francisco is becoming a bedroom suburb of Silicon Valley.
Right.
And in order to attract those commuters, and in order to attract people that are going to work in these companies, the companies are really wanting to coddle their employees. I mean, if you didn't have this as a solution and you couldn't afford to take your car, you would be in a position of taking public transportation and using it like a normal working class person. But the corporations really want to control their employees, what they do with their time, how long they stay in the office, and all of those things. So you could look at it from a completely different perspective. And that has some very serious public policy implications for the public realm and how well we're able to maintain the public realm. Because if the companies don't really have any incentive to support people using public transportation, in fact, they have a lot of incentive not to because they want to control what their employees do with their time, that has a really negative impact on the public realm. It has a negative impact on the way that people use the curb. It has a negative impact on the way that we're able to support our public transit system. It has negative impact on the way that our South Bay communities develop because, you know, who wants to live down here if you can live up there and get a private transportation to your office? So do you think that there might be some policy and legislative issues that government should be looking at or incentives that government should be offering to corporations so that what's happening is that we're having more and more private realm and less public realm. And that's a really big political and policy problem.
I think you're raising some very profound points, and I'll take it, sort of one step further. And there's actually a gentleman in the back, Jamie, that might have a follow-up question on this, but that we're actually in an era, certainly where the private realm is doing quite well, but also in transportation, private transportation systems are doing quite well. I think of bicycling as a form of private transit, peer-to-peer ride sharing. All these sort of emerging innovations are not public in that democratic sense. They're people by themselves, may not be the private automobile. But you're also raising the standpoint of if, yeah, we get all of these things, there's not an investment in something that's broadly beneficial to the public. I think it's a huge challenge. There is a public benefit of this, which is people aren't driving on the highways, and there's not the pressure there's not the congestion, which has negative air quality, nor the political pressure for additional highway investment. It's much more efficient. But ultimately, it's, as I said in the very beginning, it's a land use problem. If the companies were in a different place, they wouldn't need to do this. So I think the public but I think the public policy is pushing that. It's pushing both the densification of the job centers. Like if North Bayshore, where Google is, had 50,000 people working there, you're going to start to get to a scale where a different kind of transit system is possible. Here's an idea. Take the Caltrain line that goes up here, do a 101 bypass, bring it along 101, have a stop by Google, and have it meet up again in Redwood City. If we had the money to invest in these much more kind of forward-thinking transit systems, you could move some of these things around. But there's a public cost to that. And transit almost always is a losing proposition. Almost every rider is subsidized a little bit. And so, no, but there's no public investment there's no direct public investment. Right. But I think, there's a little bit of an interesting trade-off of if all these people were on public transit, there would be additional public investment in maintaining those systems. No, but they're not face-to-face with the public. It's a very, I don't know if you guys have reflections on this.
This is all we've been talking about. I mean, this is like because it is this sort of perfect. I mean, we stumbled into this thing. It's this perfect. Like, I have no way of being able to advocate for it one way or the other. I mean, I have no idea what should happen, right? I mean, and you're a public policy guy. I'm just, I'm trying to run a design studios, right? So, but I'm also kind of like, the urban person in me says this is a scandal that there's no public transit. The environmental person wants, thinks it's a good idea. I don't think anybody can say. I think that was sort of the main point for the whole project for me, was that, like, all that you ever hear is like, the stupid Google buses. They're just like, it's always sort of referred to as in a negative and disparaging way, and it's like, in my, the people that I run with, but there's so much more to it than that. So, but I mean, that's one of the most interesting things that I only learned this maybe 2 or 3 years ago. That all private, like, you'd think that in an age of, like, a sort of recessive age or like a recession where people are, don't have enough money to buy cars, that they would be more riding, that there'd be more public ridership, but that winds up costing the municipalities more. So this is kind of weird, like, you actually don't really want that many people to be on public transit. It's just,
if you're running it anyway, you can fill up seats, and there's no additional marginal cost, but it's a complicated.
Yeah,
So let's get some more questions, though, because I know a lot of people.
Yeah, I can offer a perspective, having worked for one of the companies on the map currently, and having been at one of the endpoints under 2 different companies. The transition has been very interesting. So the endpoint used to draw most of its workers from San Jose and down south. Now it draws the majority of the workers from the north, including San Francisco. So it's actually revitalizing San Francisco and draining San Jose. Right. So that's one aspect that San Jose may have to respond to. The other is the companies are doing this not because they have to. They want to attract the best people in the world from wherever they are. This is one of the cheapest ways for them to do that. If they could pay $10,000 more to someone and that covered the cost of their car and they thought that would work better, they might do that. But this is actually lower cost. And the reason for doing it is, the word they use often is frictionless. We want to make it as easy as possible to do what you need to do. So the infographic is very interesting and shows the flow of people. It doesn't show average speeds and the cost of operating, which is some of the things that the companies and the employees look at. If he mentioned, I think, privatization, and everything from the bicycle on up is increasing, and that's really because the public aspect has been declining for 30 years. So when these companies came along, that's sort of their response. And if you graph the average speed on 101 versus the transit options, you get insight into why some of these develop. San Jose is struggling with a light rail that average speed is slower than a bicycle. And you don't have ridership, and they're still talking about extending a line to Los Gatos for a number of people, and the light rail, yeah. So it's just an interesting perspective and a dialogue back and forth. They didn't intentionally, I don't think, care about increasing or decreasing the public space. It's just, if we want to get someone to relocate here from London, they want to live in San Francisco, and we need to get them to work fast. That was the equation one of my coworkers went through last week. So that's how they get there.
Right. Those are great points.
We'll do one here and then
Great points, but let's get more questions. I mean, it's tough to respond to.
Thanks a lot for this map. It's really cool, and your research is really interesting, so I really appreciate it. So one thing that I've noticed that I think is missing from this conversation is the word gentrification, and I don't know if you guys have left it out on purpose. So I was just wondering if you could talk, I mean, maybe you didn't use that word. It's sort of an imprecise, loaded word, whatever. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact of these shuttle stops on housing and maybe on demographic shifts that are happening in San Francisco.
Well, let me just start by saying San Francisco has been through a long transformation for a bunch of years. It used to be a much more industrial city. It became a professional services city. And there's an assumption that all these people are transforming the city. Let's remember that this is still a small share of all the people that live and work in San Francisco, right? There are technology jobs growing in San Francisco. There are technology workers living in San Francisco and out commuting. But gentrification is a complicated thing. One could argue it's just as much a product of the fact that San Francisco doesn't build very much housing. 1,000 units a year in a good year, a couple thousand in a phenomenal year. San Francisco just hasn't grown a lot. But it's this lovely place in a region that doesn't have a lot of very urban places like that. So it's highly desirable. Yes, on a micro scale, I know in my particular neighborhood, Where I live, the building I'm in with 7 units has 2 people that take shuttles to work, and that wasn't the case 5 years ago. But rents have gone up for other reasons as well. And they've been going up in lots of areas for decades. So I think it would be a mistake to say this phenomenon in and of itself is responsible for the gentrification of San Francisco, but on a micro scale, certainly, and I know that's a tension for the companies. Some of them want to say, look, we increase the rents in the neighborhoods where we have shuttle stops, but in San Francisco, that's a loaded word because that's about gentrification. But my perspective is that let's not be too simplistic that this is the reason for it.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think that was the big surprise for me. I think I mentioned this in the beginning, that like the whole section up in the marina there, I had no idea that was even, you know, I mean, for me, I thought the project was going to be much more about gentrification than it was. You know, on the other hand, this is obviously like a hipster roadmap, right? So, so it's kind of, but I also have mixed feelings about gentrification anyhow. I mean, you know, like I mentioned that too, you know, the Mission was a Mexican neighborhood. Before that, it was an Irish neighborhood. Before that, it was a German neighborhood. You know, like, so it's not, you know, gentrification is one of those things that it's another one of the things that happens to cities. And I think you're the one who said it right.
it was also downszoned when BART came in. Right? BART was built in the 70s,
Right.
2 stations opened, and they lowered the building heights. And so things weren't added there. And then over the years, it becomes more and more expensive because it's desirable and has this great transit system.
Right, or like, or what's happening on Market Street is just this totally sort of interesting phenomenon. But you know, when you talk about what Market Street used to be like, I mean, it was the coolest place in town. You know, it's so, and it was BART that ruined it, right? Or ruined it, you know. It was, so it's one of these kind of, so you know, public transit came in and basically just destroyed a whole vibrant downtown corridor. So it's, I think that
Piece of it you're talking about. Mid-market's complicated, but yes.
Yeah.
It's a,
I used to live in the Tenderloin, so I'm
Yeah,
a little.
no,
I should. My wife and I promised. Had to make a promise that we could only talk about this stuff for an hour a day, and after that we had to stop and we'd talk about something else.
let's get other questions.
Yeah, over here.
I have a question related to other gypsy transportation systems that are out in the world. And one I've kind of thought about myself. I lived in Austin, Texas, where there's a lot of gypsy buses that go back and forth between Mexico and the U.S. I know that those gypsy buses are probably all along the U.S.-Mexico border, and they're kind of also an invisible form of immigration and labor related to going back and forth along the border. So your technique or your process might be interesting to reveal some other hidden movements of people and labor. So that's more of a comment. But I'm actually interested to know more about the last mile, and if San Francisco is coming up with any new kind of innovative or hidden last mile options, similar to getting people out of cars. Like the vehicle share programs are great, but there's actually not enough places to park in downtown San Francisco. So what are other ways to move people around the shorter last mile options, like bicycle share, or the Scoot has an electric bike share program that's just kind of for less than the cost of a city bus. They've figured out a way to put over 50 electric scooters at Caltrain, the Mission, SOMA, and are encouraging people to become members. So from an urban planning perspective, what are other hidden things happening?
Well, I mean, I think you mentioned what some of the good ideas are. I mean, the human feed of, you know, is not a transportation innovation. We can walk so far in a certain number of minutes, but you know, bikes take you a little bit further. But if that's why so many people have bikes on Caltrain, right? And so Caltrain deliberately allows them. BART has explored allowing bikes on the peak hour, but BART didn't need that because it didn't have the last mile problem as much for the people riding it. Caltrain has this phenomenon. But yeah, we could imagine car sharing. San Jose for a while and still a little bit was very interested in pod cars, sort of thing they have at Heathrow, which anyone wants to talk about, we can talk about that. But I don't know if there's some profound innovation. I mean, there could be something that's a little bit more peer-to-peer, but again, I think there's still, the last mile is not just a problem of finding the transportation piece, but the psychological piece is it. You arrive at the station, if you have to wait for another mode, whether it's a bus, a light rail, bike's a little bit easier because you control it, you can control your time and it's exercise and it's pleasant, but that's a hurdle a lot of people don't want to cross. So I think there's a fundamental challenge there in that way.
I think the part I want to respond to is the part about other shadow networks and other places that are similar to this, and that's what I wanted to hear you talk about a little bit. Was you know, are there, you know, this is not, or is this something that is unique to where we are? right? Is there something similar in New York? Is there something similar in Sydney? Like, are there? I mean, you study urbanism in a global way, I would imagine. Like, is it happening in London? Is it happening in other? Because San Francisco has this kind of, or the Bay Area, I should say, has this weird. It's like very modern, but it's very fragmented in a way that a more established city like New York or London, which has just been around longer, that they've had time to. I mean, in some ways, this seems to me like it's a function of kind of how new the city is. It's kind of this weird transitory thing. It's not. We just haven't kind of rezzed into our own like real Bay Area wide transit.
Well, I'll just respond quickly on that, which is that Google doesn't run shuttles in New York because they're in the middle of Manhattan.
Yeah.
Right, and so you don't, and so it comes back to a land use issue. Bangalore has a bunch of shuttles though, right? Because they're much more in a scattered campus environment. So the shuttle, the employer shuttle, is a product of the campus. Now you're talking about a bunch of other things. New York has a bunch of informal cabs that come from other parts of outer Queens, parts of the Bronx that bring people in to Manhattan. Manhattan's 50% of the jobs of the New York area. San Francisco's 15%. Silicon Valley is not a single place, and San Francisco is in Silicon Valley now. And so some of those systems, we could map them in the Bay Area. The Outer Sunset has some of those, of people coming into downtown. And I think that would be an interesting project of looking at not the corporate shuttles, but something that's more informal. Casual carpool, right? Casual carpool has a certain flow to it, and a large number of people are doing that. Anyway, we should get more questions, but those are good.
Oh, sorry. How you doing? Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm from New York as well, and they have like China buses that take you all over the place, and they have like car services. What I was wondering is these companies that have the buses, are they owned by one does like Facebook or Google purchase the actual bus and hire the bus driver? It's a bus company.
Bus company.
So
Power is the big one.
wouldn't the bus companies know the routes as well? Like, oh, I work for Google, and this is the route they take our bus on. And so when you're saying they're fighting for spots, I mean, do they interact with other bus drivers in the same company of their route and go, okay, today I'm going to be handling Google's buses?
I'm pretty sure that it's, I mean, Bauer is the big one, but there are others.
And well, Google owns, I think Google had it with Bauer, and then they've purchased a bunch themselves, so they're now controlling it internally. But it's a contract, so I mean, it's, they have a contract with that company, and so the company is just, I don't think Bauer's coordinating among the different companies that much.
Let's say one company ran the Facebook, Apple, and Google, then I wonder if the company themselves could form a pass that you can transfer.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, this looks like, I love it because it looks like the New York subway map. So, the thing is like, it's cool because what if I could purchase, a park hopper pass, and I could jump from a Google bus to a Facebook bus.
Like a Clipper for tech companies.
Yeah.
That would, I mean, I think you're getting at some of the longer term potential, but I don't think the companies, it's not in their interest. And I think that's in part this contradiction. Right. So it's not, why would they do that? It's not, it's
because
not
maybe someone could give them a tax break on it.
Well, it looks like someone has made a quick follow-up. I don't know if there's a...
I've been involved in some of those discussions with Sustainable Silicon Valley and others about that, and I also work for a company that's involved in this. There's a concern, there was a question, or an answer raised earlier that says, could we ban these together? And this is really about bringing the workplace to the door. The companies do not view this as transporting you from home to work. It's about you get on that device, that bus, and you're at work.
Right.
And so they don't want, the last thing Apple and Google want is their employees going hither and yon and say, hey, what's going on your device? There's a huge security concern. It's not the only issue, but if you don't want your employees sitting alongside of competitors' employees either being poached or losing information. And so that's a part of the issue there.
I think that's the nut of it right there, is that you are actually at work when you're on these things, and that's even though they're on public roads using public stops. It's basically you have a little mobile office that you're driving around.
As one of the people in the company said, if you got a couple of high-paid software engineers working for that hour on the bus, it pays for itself.
Yeah.
So back to the subsidy question, they're making it. It's an investment because they're getting work out of that time. But